came for the sanctuary of a remote Welsh valley.
My name is Angharad. They say I do not speak.
They weren't prepared for what they found.
Aren't you frightened to be here alone?
Why should we be frightened?
You should lock your doors and windows at night.
Who's Angharad?
She's Harold's sister. She's not normal.
I'm beginning to think this whole valley's a sort of extended nut house.
Diana Rigg, Elaine Page and Joanna David star in Unexplained Laughter, tonight at 9:30 on BBC1.
Catastrophe or Utopia? Split Screen argues the case for and against genetic engineering on 2 shortly. Here on 1, another chance to join Alan Wicker on Walkabout in the Land of Oz, where the famous shade of the coolibah tree now conceals a hidden pot of gold in Living with Waltzing Matilda. And next week, Alan Wicker meets an émigré Bristolian who's pitted himself against the deadly croc. Now on 1, Anne Robinson pins back the shell likes for your points of view.
Hello and good evening, and a few quick points to begin. Thank you, Cathy Stewart in Holland, for sending us this quaint Dutch description of one BBC programme received there via cable.
20 hours, Wogan, Pratt Show.
And thank you, Ms. R.N. Aldridge, for pointing out a piece of genius scheduling.
This month is Ramadan for Muslims, so the BBC show a series of programmes about Muslims, the first of which was shown on Thursday, April 13th at 12:20 a.m.
Which is just about as near to useless as you can get, because
we Muslims fast between sunrise and sunset, wake at 4 a.m. for our morning meal, keep going until 8 at night when we eat and drink and pray, and go to bed so we can wake up at 4 the next morning.
Now, as you know, American soap stars never really die. They just fade away until the money gets better, or, as in the case of Roger Grimes, who might have looked dead as a dodo at the bottom of a lake in Dynasty, but in fact, according to Felicity Jenkinson of the Channel Isles,
Then thought, to blazes with Fallon, I'll turn into Carter McKay's long-lost son and pester the set of Dallas instead.
and he did.
You look great.
Hey, why not? Haven't done much but lay around the last couple of years.
Now, as you would expect, a huge response and letters are still pouring in about the tragedy at Hillsborough the Saturday before last. A great many, like this one from Pauline Margeson in Nottingham.
On this very sad occasion, I feel I must write and say how, with great dignity, the BBC Late Sports programme handled the events. Desmond Lynam and Jimmy Hill were superb and talked us through this awful day with reverence and sorrow, which I know is echoed around this country. And my heart goes out to all the Liverpool families. Thank you, BBC.
But several viewers felt concern at the news coverage that Saturday.
I heard the horrifying news from Sheffield Football Ground and saw live television pictures showing the tail end of the clear-up operation. Following Grandstand, the BBC News reported the same incident at length. We were treated to horrific close-ups, showing in graphic detail the ordeal that the football fans had endured that afternoon.
Caroline Hodges of Kidderminster goes on.
I understand that news has to be reported, but surely there were several cameras at the match. Long-distance shots would have sufficed to report the tragedy.
And the argument for those close-up pictures showing graphic details of the tragedy is put by Sheila Edwards of Daventry.
Showing the disaster was necessary. How could we even imagine its seriousness, or believe that the stated causes were true without seeing it for ourselves? I have to admit that, without having seen it, I would have believed it to be caused by the so-called soccer hooligans, as would many others.
Now, what a pity QED didn't bring its cameras to the Points of View office. What better place to find different examples of handwriting, which was the subject of the programme the week before last. In another word, graphology.
What a shame that such a great opportunity was lost for a serious evaluation of this subject.
Writes Rena Nezos, who is
Principal of the College of Graphology.
And she goes on to explain,
why didn't QED set out clearly what graphology can achieve and what it can't? It can assess a personality and a relative ability to undertake certain skills or responsibilities. What it certainly can't do is tell what job a person is actually doing. That belongs to the realm of clairvoyance or to parlour games.
On the other hand, Mrs. Reed of Petworth claims precisely the opposite is the case.
It's not the function of the graphologist to pinpoint the occupation for which we would be best suited, rather to try to establish the job we have, for whatever reason, chosen.
Yes, I mean, a stodgy old solicitor might really be much better in showbiz, as Anton Rogers, playing Alec in May to December, demonstrated, and many, many requests for a clip.
I can look my dog.
God, you're an idiot. I've let a lunatic into the house. Hello, Mum. Hello, Dad. I don't think you've met my solicitor.
The versatile Anton Rogers, less well received in the sitcom category, Morris Minor's Marvellous Motors.
It's leading the stakes for the most boring summer series Gold Award 1989.
And
an insult to our intelligence.
And a really plaintive cry from Reginald Job, who is a
MIBCM
and a
MBIE.
Not to mention a
freelance engineering project designer and draftsman.
Who was
one of the team mainly responsible for the design of the Morris Minor, and I write to express my disappointment. To use the name Morris Minor in connection with such a programme is an insult to the much-loved car and to those who designed and built it.
And from insults to Morris Minors to insults to the audience of Open to Question when Miss Janet Street Porter, head of youth programmes, was in the hot seat.
I was disgusted by the way she treated the young people asking the questions. She attacked them left, right and centre. She was definitely not open to question.
Says Eva Dixon, age 15.
She was arrogant and evasive.
Says Sue Shrin, also 15, and Charlotte McConnell, who doesn't say how old she is, thinks
it's tremendously sad that on a programme designed for people between the ages of 16 and 25, Janet Street Porter felt unable to give those people a chance to express themselves.
And for those of all ages who didn't see the programme, here's a snippet.
Why don't you just ask me what you want to ask me without relating to some drivel you've read in a tabloid?
OK, your forceful personality, couldn't that be taken as a sign, as a lack of your self-confidence in your own ability? Therefore, you can't be open to outside input, but have to have an opinion and stick to that opinion through a lack of confidence?
No.
You're not going to elaborate on that?
No, I think it's a stupid question.
Yes, Nick.
The very approachable Miss Janet Street Porter. Now, dreary Donna's exit from EastEnders has been badly received by mothers of young children. Mrs. S. Bowling of Leyland will speak for them.
As a special treat, I allowed my 8-year-old daughter to stay up later than usual to watch the excellent Last of the Summer Wine, broadcast at 8 p.m. after EastEnders. We turned on early and caught the last few minutes of EastEnders. First, we saw a domestic row between Carmel and Matthew, which included scenes of physical violence, then a gruesome shot of Donna, apparently dead and covered in vomit.
What, demands Mrs. B?
Happened to the much publicised watershed of 9 p.m, which I personally thought was a very sensible and responsible idea.
Finally, to some little people who never really offend anyone.
It was a delight to watch Wildlife on One on hedgehogs.
But, says Miss J. Wood, age 14, there is an important fact which must be brought to viewers' attention.
In one part of the film, there was a hedgehog eating bread and milk which had been left out for it. But cow's milk can kill hedgehogs. Much better to leave hedgehogs a dish of cat food.
I bet cats don't think so. Anyway, cow's milk doesn't harm them as long as they don't have it all the time. And I'll leave you with a little bit of the hedgehogs, who look very healthy. Oh, and please remind everyone, we've moved to Tuesdays. They needed a hand with the ratings. Good night.
The hedgehog is drawn towards the house to feed. A field, a garden away, its dish of bread and milk is waiting.
Beginning next Tuesday on BBC1.
Stop talking about her!
He was old enough to be her father.
Anybody think they're having an affair the way we're carrying on?
She wanted a father for a child she wasn't allowed.
It ruins everything.
How can you think like
like that?
It's an accident. It's a mistake.
A baby!
Someone else in our house.
Two people brought together in a moment of crisis, unaware that the real crisis was about to begin.
Just don't always expect me to be in control.
Starring Annette Crosby, Rhys Dinsdale, Maggie O'Neill and Keith Barron in Take Me Home, beginning next Tuesday at 9:35 on BBC1.
Starting in a couple of minutes over on 2, it's the quarter-finals on the Green Bays in the World Snooker Championship. The play on 1 in half an hour stars Diana Rigg and Elaine Page in Unexplained Laughter, based on the novel by Alice Thomas Ellis. Now the news at 9 o'clock with Martin Lewis.
Another purge in the Kremlin, a mass resignation by 110 of the old-timers blocking the path to reform. Mr. Gorbachev talks of a very serious regrouping of forces within Soviet society dictated by new tasks. And Liverpool asks the Football Association for more time before deciding whether to resume play in the FA Cup. Good evening. In one of the biggest shake-ups in the Kremlin since the revolution of 1917, more than a quarter of the Soviet Central Committee, the main policy-making body, have resigned to clear the way for President Gorbachev to speed up his policy of perestroika, the reshaping of Soviet society. In all, 110 politicians and officials have asked to go because, as they put it, they were beyond retirement age. They included 11 senior figures who were closely linked to Mr. Gorbachev's now disgraced predecessor, Leonid Brezhnev. The Soviet president told the one-day committee session that approved the changes, life goes on. There is a very serious regrouping of forces within the party and within society as a whole.
The 300 members of the Central Committee had been summoned to the Kremlin to hear a critical assessment of the party's performance in recent months. Many of them knew that by the end of the meeting, their political careers would be at an end. And that's a reflection of the newfound importance attached to popular opinion here.
The party called this meeting to discuss the failure of many of its leading candidates in last month's elections, and the extent of the changes it's wrought in the Central Committee reflects the leadership's concern over the party's faltering image.
Andrei Gromyko, the long-serving former foreign minister, is typical of the men removed from the Central Committee. They're all members of the old guard of Soviet politicians, widely blamed for slowing down Mr. Gorbachev's reforms. Speaking immediately after the meeting, the party's ideology chief, Vadim Medvedev, described the changes as a serious and important milestone in the course of perestroika. But he didn't hide that they were also a response to public dissatisfaction.
At the same time, the Soviet people are stating their disapproval at the base of perestroika, at the forms and methods of implementing perestroika, and what is the main thing, as to the lack of real results, especially in what regards the social and economic sphere.
That popular disapproval of communist orthodoxy resulted in the mass outpouring of support for Kremlin rebel Boris Yeltsin last month. His success as much a protest vote against the leadership's failure to secure improvements in the economy. While the changes in the Central Committee give Mr. Gorbachev a firm grip on the central organs of power, something which virtually guaranteed success for previous Soviet leaders, he's finding that the main danger for his policies is now coming from the grassroots. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, in our Oxford studio is Sir Brian Cartledge, Britain's ambassador to Moscow until the end of last year and now principal of Linacre College, Oxford. Sir Brian, in Gorbachev, are we now looking at an extremely clever political operator or an increasingly desperate one?
I think primarily clever. He certainly has enough problems to make any normal politician desperate, but I don't think he is desperate. He has shown once again the tremendous speed with which he can move, and not for the first time. The elections for the Congress of People's Deputies was only just over a month ago, and within that time, the amount of arm twisting which must have gone on behind the scenes in order to get these 110 Central Committee members voluntarily to resign is obviously very considerable. And the fact he's managed to do it so quickly, rather than having to wait until the next party congress, which he normally would have had to do in order to get a clear out of the Central Committee, I think is a great tribute to his political skills.
Mr. Gorbachev has complained in the past that opposition to his reform programme exists all the way to the Central Committee. Has he now cleared the decks of all that opposition?
I think what he's done is to remove the support which those within the Politburo, and there are still one or two, might have hoped to mobilise in the event of deciding that their deciding that perestroika was going too far and too fast. I mean, we know that Ligachev and Chebrikov, the former head of the KGB, probably have quite considerable reservations about the speed with which Glasnost in particular is going, and about the way in which the nationalities problems are mounting. What he has done is now to remove the votes which they might have been able to mobilise within the Central Committee, and so they are to that extent isolated.
So briefly, Sir Brian, is any backlash by the hard Conservatives likely or possible?
I think it's much less likely now than it was. It would take a very considerable crisis in the non-Russian republics, or perhaps in Eastern Europe, to create the kind of coalition of Conservatives, KGB and military, which alone, in my view, could unseat Gorbachev.
Sir Brian, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Football Association says it's agreed to a request from Liverpool Football Club to put off a decision on whether the team should continue in this season's FA Cup. The statement follows nearly 6 hours of talks between the Liverpool board and the Football Association. It's understood some members of the Liverpool board still feel it's too soon after the Hillsborough tragedy to make up their minds on what to do.
The Liverpool manager Kenny Dalglish spent most of the working day at Anfield. Then, just after 4 o'clock, he left, amidst rumours of a meeting at a secret venue. He's spoken over the last 10 days for the players, some of whom were also at the ground after attending funerals this morning. Profoundly affected by the Hillsborough tragedy, they've been largely incapable of focusing their thoughts on whether the FA Cup semi-final against Nottingham Forest should be played or not. Peter Robinson, the club's chief executive, was equally reluctant to hint at the likely outcome of the meeting.
Will the decision be based on what the players have told you?
Actually, I really can't say any more. Thank you very much.
The decision, expected in the early evening, didn't come. Then, at just after 8 o'clock, the Football Association released a statement saying it could grant the club until the weekend to make up its mind. The FA's announcement reflects its own concern that it should not be seen to be pushing the club into a decision it feels incapable of making. Victims of Hillsborough remain to be buried here on Merseyside. The intense grief in Liverpool, whilst marginally lighter than last week, is still present, affecting players and directors at the club, as well as the bereaved. Opinions differ at the club as to whether the game should go ahead. It's even been suggested that some minds were changed during the day. Meanwhile, the promise of last Thursday was being fulfilled today. Work started on removing the perimeter fencing at Anfield's Cop End. The potential dangers of the fences in an emergency are judged more significant than the risks of a pitch invasion, which the club doesn't perceive as an immediate problem.
We will have more policemen on duty for the bigger games, but we don't think we'll need anything like that. I'm sure people will respect the idea. That's why we're taking them down.
Liverpool's first league match after Hillsborough will be at Goodison Park, the home of Everton, a week tomorrow. It'll coincide with the Prince of Wales' visit to Anfield to meet those who've worked behind the scenes during the week of mourning. However, there's criticism from some on Merseyside that Saturday's memorial service will not be attended by a senior member of the royal family.
I'm disappointed at that. They've made a mistake. It's a national event. It's a national tragedy surrounding the national game, and I think the nation's leaders should have been there.
Also today, volunteers were counting the tens of thousands of pounds collected at Anfield since the Hillsborough disaster, amongst them Bob Paisley, the former manager, now a director. The club shaped its own message to those who'd given it help. Now the stadium, which has been a shrine for over a week, is making an effort to return to football once again.
A special telephone hotline for people wanting to give the police information about what happened at Hillsborough dealt with nearly 1,000 calls on its first day of operation today. Witnesses can call a free phone number 0800 99 1199. That's 0800 99 1199. The lines are now closed but will be open again tomorrow morning. The hotline is being run by the West Midlands Force, who are conducting an inquiry into the policing of the match. Many of the callers have been distressed and have had to be comforted by the police officers answering the phones. After the information has been logged and assessed, some witnesses will be contacted again and asked to make detailed statements. The Japanese government has begun the search for a new prime minister following the announcement earlier today that Mr. Noboru Takeshita was resigning over a long-running bribe scandal. Mr. Takeshita said he must take responsibility for the loss of public confidence in politics. He admitted taking more than £500,000 from Recruit, the communications company at the heart of the scandal.
In a country where saving face is all, Mr. Takeshita had lost his completely. As charges over the Recruit affair mounted, the national budget was stalled in Parliament. The polls showed public support at less than 4%, and at the weekend came a new admission that the Prime Minister had, after all, received large political donations from Recruit. He announced he'd be stepping down as soon as the budget was passed.
I feel keenly responsible for these events, and particularly for the fact that I have contributed to the current public mistrust of politics in Japan.
Japan's prosecutors have charged Recruit's founder and a dozen others with bribery, and 3 cabinet ministers were shamed into resigning when their links with Recruit came out. First, last December, was the finance minister. Recruit shares were traded in his name. By the year end, the justice minister had gone, admitting he'd had Recruit funds. In January, the economic planning minister also went. He'd had funds too. They explained themselves, saying that in Japan you need money, millions of pounds, in fact, each time there's an election. Big business provides it, and members of parliament hand it out liberally to their constituents at weddings and social events. The Japanese themselves call it structural corruption, and so far they've been ready to pay the price for the sake of the continuing economic miracle.
There's no way in which Japan's political system is going to change because of this. The resignation of Takeshita does not mean a change, essential change in Japanese political behavior. The relationship between politicians and big business and the transactions that involve money will continue.
The stock market welcomed the news of the Prime Minister's departure with its biggest rise for a month. But nobody knows who will follow Mr. Takeshita. The prosecution has not yet rested its case. And now, beneath the normally placid face of Japanese politics, lies a deep uncertainty about the future.
Here, Mrs. Thatcher has warned West Germany not to split NATO over short-range nuclear weapons. The German government wants talks with the Soviet Union about reducing the number of missiles in Europe. But Britain and the United States say there can be no such negotiations at the moment. In angry exchanges with Neil Kinnock in the Commons this afternoon, the Prime Minister insisted that NATO's strategy could not be decided by one country acting alone.
Hungary this morning, and the first Soviet tanks roll back from the Warsaw Pact front line. Tanks from the division that helped crush the 1956 uprising, now helping Mr. Gorbachev and his peace moves towards the West. Among those invited to witness the event he'd promised almost 5 months ago, the incongruous figure of Cicciolina, the Italian porn star MP, who, in a bizarre incident, released a dove only to lose it to the tracks of one of the tanks. NATO's long demanded the Russians cut their forces, but now that they are, it's prompting disagreement in the alliance. Many in the West, especially in West Germany, are increasingly convinced that if tanks are being cut in Europe, so should nuclear weapons, not the view taken by Mrs. Thatcher and President Bush. They're worried by the position West Germany's Chancellor Helmut Kohl adopted this weekend, swinging his government's policy behind that of his left-leaning Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher. He was back this afternoon from Washington after failing to convince the Americans of Germany's new demand for talks soon on Europe's short-range nuclear forces. It's the nuclear Lance missile stationed in West Germany that they want cut. With a 70-mile range, it would fall if used on German soil. And at a time when it's becoming increasingly unpopular with Germans, NATO's military commanders, backed by London and Washington, want to replace it with a more powerful version. The division in NATO was reflected this afternoon at Westminster.
When 2/3 of the people of West Germany are against the modernization of short-range nuclear weapons, isn't the German government absolutely right to act upon their view?
Short-range nuclear weapons are part of the NATO strategy. It is NATO's strategy that is being discussed, and NATO's strategy cannot be determined by any one country.
That one country is, of course, West Germany, and this weekend, when Mrs. Thatcher travels there to see Chancellor Kohl, she'll have firm words for him, stressing, according to Whitehall sources tonight, how much Germany's freedom depends on NATO. Ahead of them both is a NATO summit next month and the need to reach agreement to avoid too public a split there. Though NATO leaders have managed that for the last 40 years, it's not easy to see how they'll achieve it this time.
The Education Secretary, Kenneth Baker, is changing the way colleges and universities are funded. From next year, the amount of money they receive will depend on the number of students they can attract.
This increase in fees signals a big shift in the way universities and polytechnics are funded. It'll have no immediate effect on most students because their tuition fees are currently paid for them by the state. But for the institutions, it'll mean more of their income will come from fees and less from government grant. Ministers believe that will encourage them to compete for students in a more market-orientated system.
Under the new system, every university, every college, every polytechnic will have an incentive to expand, because for every extra student they will get extra government money. So this will be an incentive for them to expand. It'll increase their independence.
Government proposals to replace student grants with loans and the leaking of documents suggesting the government is looking at radical new ways of funding higher education have led some to suspect this increase in fees is a first step towards requiring all but the poorest students to pay their way through university.
We've already had student loans. We're now going to see the introduction of fees for students, and that will mean that the role of the state will gradually be reduced to that, in the words of the Lord Chilver, Chairman of the Universities Funding Council, of charity, when students from lower income homes will be deterred from taking a course at a university or a college.
Mr. Baker recently repeated his wish to raise the number of students in higher education from 1 to 2 million. He knows the Treasury won't finance that sort of expansion, and that's why higher education funding is in the melting pot.
The employers' organisation, the CBI, say there is clear evidence that the economic boom is definitely over. Their latest quarterly survey indicates a further fall in business optimism and slower manufacturing growth. And building society figures show that in the first 3 months of the year, the number of new mortgages has dropped by a quarter. The building societies say they do not expect an early recovery.
This is the strongest evidence so far that the economy is slowing down, as the Chancellor hoped. CBI members say it's now so pronounced that employment in manufacturing will drop over the next 4 months. It's not just in industry. Today, the building societies said new mortgages have fallen by a quarter in the last 3 months. But too sharp a slowdown could be dangerous.
There are signs that some projects are being put on hold, and I think that if the interest rates went up, that might encourage people, companies, to slow down their investment in the future. That would be very bad for the medium and longer term future of this country.
To get inflation down, the economy has to grow much more slowly this year than last. Mr. Lawson hoped that would help the trade deficit. He thought that as companies got fewer orders at home, they'd increase their export efforts. This survey shows that isn't happening. Today, Jaguar, a major exporter, said the strength of the pound, a consequence of high interest rates, had cut their profits on exports. Many companies are finding their export markets are tougher, and with imports still strong, the Chancellor faces a political embarrassment in each month's trade figures, the first of which is tomorrow. The city says a deficit over £1.5 billion could push interest rates straight up, just the medicine the CBI doesn't want.
The broadcasting unions at the BBC are planning another 24-hour strike in support of their pay claim. After yesterday's industrial action, union leaders said they will give management time to return to the negotiating table before announcing the date of further action. The BBC has offered its staff a 7% increase. The unions want 16%.
Further industrial action at the BBC now seems inevitable after a 3-hour meeting tonight of representatives from both the corporation's 2 main staff unions, the National Union of Journalists and BETA, the Broadcasting and Entertainment Trades Alliance.
The unions say more than 11,000 of their members, from a total BBC staff of 28,500, took part in yesterday's walkout, and they say they're confident of the same level of support for future action. They've given the BBC until tomorrow to respond to an offer of further talks.